Alright, so the second essay that I'm going to go over is the prose passage essay. And in many ways this is similar to the poetry one, so if you haven't watched the poetry video yet, do that, because this video is going to be shorter, because a lot of the things are the same. At the first point, again, it's this thesis point. So you get the point if you respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensive interpretation of the passage. So again, just reviewing like last time, you can get the thesis point no matter where it is in your essay, but I suggest making sure that you plan ahead of time and have an outline and know what your thesis is and know where you're headed with it, because you're more likely to get both that point and the evidence points that tie into it. The other thing about this is really focusing on that interpretation piece. If you're just restating the thesis, or restating the passage rather in your thesis, and you aren't really bringing anything that provokes discussion in any way, then it's not going to get the point. You need to have something that is interpreting the passage, but that you can defend with evidence from the text. And so with this one, you're going to use a lot of that level 1 stuff as evidence, but you need to be in that level 2, 3 for your thesis. You need to have that interpretation and that larger connection to either the passage as a whole or how the passage ties into the world at large, which we get into in that last point. Other than that, I do want to say that a lot of my students choose this as the one that they spend their most time on. So people are a little iffy on the poetry one. That one makes them nervous that they're going to interpret it wrong, even though you just need to defend your interpretation. And sometimes the open-ended passage can be harder for people because you have to remember all the characters of the book and make sure you're not just relying on plot summary. So a lot of students focus on this as their essay that they're going to spend the most amount of time on and make sure that it's as perfect as possible. So instead of spending the 40 minutes maybe on this one, you spend a whole hour and divide your time between the other two essays. Next, looking at that evidence points, again, pretty much the same as the poetry one. You're getting more points based on how consistently you present evidence that ties back to your thesis, how much commentary you use to explain your evidence. So that's great that you are reading this passage and you see that we're using a lot of dialogue back and forth, but what is that dialogue doing? And how does that tie back to your thesis? What is the point of having mainly dialogue as opposed to description? And then if you are getting that 4 points, you're explaining how those literary elements or techniques contribute back into your passage. Making sure that it's specific, making sure that you're using multiple things, or if it's the same device over and over again, although you should probably be able to find multiple devices, but say there are a bunch of different symbols, just make sure that you're describing each of those symbols and tying it back to your thesis. And the last point, again, is that sophistication point. And with the sophistication point, you are demonstrating sophistication of thought and or developing a complex literary argument, but you need to be identifying and exploring complexities or tensions within the passage, or illuminating your interpretation by situating it within a broader context. So those are the level 3 ideas. Accounting for alternative interpretations of the passage, so those counterclaims, or employing a style that's consistently vivid and persuasive. So the writing is just heads above other people's writing. Again, I personally would not focus on this last part. If you make sure that you have your thesis and all of your evidence ties back to your thesis and you're describing all of your evidence and how your evidence is contributing to the passage as a whole and how it all ties together and the organization is there, you might just get the sophistication point, but you need to make sure that those things are really strong because this is just one point. If you say the thesis is also just one point, so why should I focus as much on that? Well, you get your evidence points based on whether they're tying back to the thesis, so you can't get all of the evidence points or even most of the evidence points if you don't have a thesis for those things to tie back to. So that is the prose essay. Like I said, a lot shorter than my other video because it's pretty much the same as the poetry one, only it's prose. And so if you have any questions, let me know.